right, so we're on page 17, Controlled Substances Act of 1970. The Controlled Substances Act, CSA, also known as the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, established the regulations surrounding controlled substances that all manufacturers, importers, exporters, distributors, researchers, hospitals, pharmacies, prescribers, and pharmacists have to follow. Controlled substances, again, we know this, they're drugs that have the potential for addiction and abuse and thus require more strict regulation and control. Drugs that were categorized by this act fall into one of 5 schedules based on their relative potential for abuse. This Controlled Substances Act of 1970 established a closed system for manufacturing, distributing, and dispensing drugs to reduce drug diversion. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, enforces the Controlled Substances Act. More about this will be discussed in the Controlled Substances chapters. The next act that we're going to look at is the Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970. So before the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, or the PPPA, before this was implemented, accidental poisoning was the top cause of injury in children that were less than 5 years old. So there was no standard way to protect children from common dangerous substances, including medicines and household chemicals, before this Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970 was implemented. The PPPA, it is enforced by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It requires a number of household substances and medications to be packaged in child-resistant CR packaging. The packaging must be significantly difficult for a child under 5 years of age to open within a reasonable time frame, and not difficult for normal adults and elderly to open and use properly. Child-resistant packaging is discussed further in the pharmacy practice chapter. The next act that we're going to look at on the bottom of page 17 is the Drug Listing Act of 1972, which was amended, which amended the FDCA. Again, the FDCA we covered back on page 14. It's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. So the Drug Listing Act of 1972 amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 to require drug establishments that are engaged in manufacturing, preparation, propagation, compounding, or processing of a drug to register all of their drugs with the FDA. Each individual listed drug was required to have a unique National Drug Code, or NDC. So let's go over that one more time. The Drug Listing Act of 72, it amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA of 1938, to require drug establishments that are engaged in the manufacturing, preparation, propagation, compounding, or processing of medicines to register all of their medicines with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Each individual listed medicine is required to have a unique NDC, which is the National Drug Code NDC number. Page 18 continues this. So the NDC is the product identifier that is present on over-the-counter and RX drug packaging and inserts. The NDC is a 10 or 11 digit code. It has 3 segments. The first segment is the labeler code, and it's 4 or 5 digits. The labeler is the manufacturer, the distributor, the repackager of the prescription medication. This number, so the first segment of the number, is assigned by the FDA. The second segment is the product code, which is 3 or 4 digits. It identifies strength, dosage, and formulation. This number is determined by the labeler or the manufacturer. The third segment is the package code, which is just 1 or 2 digits. This identifies the package size and the type. This number is determined by the labeler or the manufacturer. Now, back in 2022, the FDA proposed a new rule to move to a uniform 12-digit NDC format, which would have a 6-digit labeler code, a 4-digit product code, and 2-digit package code. Now, if this is enacted, there will be an effective date 5 years after the publication of the final rule. So that could even go into effect maybe in 2027. So we'll wait and see for that. We're continuing on page 18. So we have the Federal Anti-Tampering Act of 1982. So there's a picture here on page 18 of tamper-evident packaging. So think about like when you open a supplement, right, or you open some fish oil, it has that glossy tamper lid that you have to peel off to open the bottle, which is located under the cap. It seals the bottle. So in 1982, there were 7 people who died after they ingested adulterated drugs. Right, so before I was born, the year before, 7 people died after ingesting adulterated drugs in the Chicago area. These victims, they had ingested over-the-counter Tylenol, and these were capsules that had been laced with cyanide, potassium cyanide. In response to this tragedy, the Federal Anti-Tampering Act of 1982 was passed. It made it a federal crime to tamper with any OTC product and required tamper-resistant features on OTC medications and supplements. The label of the package must also indicate the tamper-resistant feature. Certain products are exempt from using tamper-resistant features in the packaging. These include things like insulin, lozenges, toothpaste, and like skin products and lotions. The next one, the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, the best year ever. In response to a major public campaign by people with rare diseases and their supporters, the Orphan Drug Act was approved in 1983. Before this act, there was little financial motivation for drug makers to invest in drugs that would treat a small number of people. An orphan drug treats a disease that affects less than 2,000 people in the United States, or it offers no reasonable expectation that the sales revenue will recover the cost of research and development. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983 offers incentives to manufacturers of orphan drugs, including a tax credit. So 50% of clinical testing costs and 7 years of market exclusivity. Then in 1984, we have the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984. It's also referred to as the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984. So previously, generic drugs were required to go through the same lengthy and costly FDA approval process as new drugs. Congress passed this Hatch-Waxman Act, or the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, to streamline generic drug approvals and to streamline generic drug approvals and to grant patent protection to drug innovators. The manufacturer that made the brand name drug is the drug innovator. The purpose of the legislation is to increase availability of generics and cut costs for the patient and the healthcare system. Moving to page 19, provisions in the legislation have made it possible for generic drug companies to file one of two abbreviated applications for generic drug approval. So they could file an abbreviated new drug application, an ANDA, or the 505(b)(2) application. This legislation grants up to 5 years of market exclusivity to the company that created the brand name drug to make up for the effort that this company or manufacturer conducted, to make up for the effort the company spent conducting clinical trials to establish safety and efficacy. We're on page 19. We're looking at the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. The Prescription Drug Marketing Act, or the PDMA, of 1987 was enacted to reduce public health risks from adulterated, misbranded, counterfeit, or expired drugs. The law essentially prohibits re-importation. Prescription drug products manufactured in the United States and subsequently exported to a foreign country cannot be re-imported back into the United States except by the product's manufacturer. The sale of drug samples and coupons was prohibited. Drug samples are meant to be provided by the prescriber to the patient at no cost. Drug coupons are either given to prescribers or provided to patients at no cost, or are given to consumers by the manufacturer in some type of product promotion, like an advertisement. Patients cannot buy drugs in other countries and bring them into the United States except under a few different conditions. So again, we're talking about the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. And patients essentially cannot buy drugs in other countries and bring them back to the U.S. except if, first, the quantity is less than a 90-day supply or equal to a 90-day supply, and it's for that specific patient. They cannot resell it to another patient. Also, the condition of an effective treatment is not available in the United States. So, being that the condition is serious and the drug being imported has no unreasonable risk, then they could buy the medication like in Canada or Mexico or Panama or whatever, and then bring them to the United States. So it has to be for the patient less than or equal to 90 days supply. There can be no effective treatment available in the United States, a serious condition, and pose no unreasonable risk to bringing the medication here. The patient may need to affirm the above in writing. Baggage is not supposed to be searched by law enforcement without a reasonable suspicion of what the contents might include that could pose a risk to other travelers. So the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987, the PDMA, required wholesalers to be state licensed and meet uniform standards. It blocked hospitals from reselling drugs that they purchased at a discount for profit. The act, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987, it placed strict limits on the percentage of drugs that hospital pharmacies can resell. Currently, selling drugs to another hospital, like a hospital that is not part of the same hospital group or purchasing organization, it's only permitted in an emergency situation or pursuant to a prescription order. At the bottom of page 19, we have the OBRA 90. So this is the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990, or OBRA 90. So concerns about improper med use and inefficient use of federal dollars spent on healthcare led to the OBRA 90. OBRA 90 essentially requires pharmacists to perform a prospective drug utilization review, so a prospective DUR, and pharmacists are required to provide counseling for all Medicaid beneficiaries before dispensing the prescription to the patient. Now, most states have expanded counseling requirements to all patients. States were also required to implement a retrospective drug utilization review, a retrospective DUR program, to look for patterns of fraud, waste, abuse, overuse, and medically unnecessary care. Counseling and DUR requirements are reviewed in more detail in the pharmacy practice chapter. All right, so then let's see, we're on page 20, and we have about 4 more pages before we hit our timeline summary. We'll take a break here.